Welcome to Straight to Why, where we bring you the why behind the people, companies, and ideas that are transforming our world. Today, Dr. James Gordon joins us. He is a Harvard-educated psychiatrist, founder and executive director of the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, and a pioneer in integrating mind-body practices into mainstream healthcare. For decades, he has worked with individuals and communities healing from trauma caused by war, genocide, natural disasters, and other devastating events. He is also the author of several books and essays that focus on practical approaches to both recovery and resilience. He was chairman under Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush of the White House Commission on Complementary and Alternative Medicine Policy. Dr. Gordon is currently a clinical professor at Georgetown's Medical School. Dr. Gordon, thank you for joining us on Straight to Why. I have to say, wow, what a list of accomplishments, and I feel incredibly lucky to have you here today.
Well, it's good to be here with you.
Doctor, I thought I would start at the beginning. In your latest book, Transforming Trauma, The Path to Hope and Healing, you talk about the early reasons why your medical journey led you to focus on the connection between the mind and the body. For our listeners, could you briefly share why you chose the path you've taken? Perhaps you can share some examples of early catalytic moments for you. In essence, I think we really want to know your why behind your life's body of tremendous work.
After 9/11, I and Center for Mind-Body Medicine work with New York City firefighters. And we got to know them very well. We were teaching slow, deep breathing and other forms of meditation. One New York City firefighter lieutenant got up and said, "What is this, some kind of chick flick?" He was one of the smartest, toughest, funniest people I've ever met. And he participated thoroughly in our program and ultimately became the great advocate and practitioner of our work. After about 6 or 8 months, we were sitting around talking, and he looked at me and he said, "Hey, Jim, I get it. You're just like us." And I said, "That's a real compliment because I admire you guys so much." "But what do you mean?" He said, "Well, you like to help people and you like to be where the action is." And I said, "Fair enough." And in a way, that's how I started in medicine. I wanted to do something useful for people, and I wanted to work with people when they were going through the most difficult times in their lives. Also, I was very interested in people's stories. Psychiatry was really where I could make a huge difference by getting to know people and encouraging them to tell their stories and encouraging them to make discoveries through those stories. So from the beginning, I was focused on people, whole people, and understanding, as we were taught in physiology, that what we think and feel could affect what goes on in our bodies and vice versa. Even back in the early 60s when I was in medical school, there was that understanding, which has only grown over the years. At a certain point in time, as I began to work with people using psychotherapy, creating therapeutic communities for people, and I could see the power of working with people individually and of creating supportive communities and how that could really create a process of transformation in people. But I began to wonder, is there some way to work with biology that would complement and be, in a sense, a parallel to working with people psychotherapeutically or working to create supportive communities? So I became very interested in those approaches. How could nutrition, how could physical exercise, how could meditation, how could acupuncture and Chinese medicine, which began to interest me by 1969, 70. I was interested because I started to look at the research coming out of China. And one of the things I've always paid attention to is who are the potential teachers who arise in my life. So one of the teachers I had in medical school when I was going through a difficult time was the therapist I consulted, a man named Robert Coles. He was working with the kids who were integrating the schools in New Orleans, and I was impressed with what he was doing. He was a psychiatrist who was seeing patients, but he was also doing something useful in the world. And I went to see him as a therapist when I sort of was going through a rough time in my life. And he was there for me, and he listened to me. In fact, I called him on the phone. I was in New York at the time doing a fellowship at Cornell, and he talked with me for 2 hours. on the phone. Didn't know me, didn't pay anything, just he was there. So he became an important person who opened me to all different possibilities of being both a psychiatrist with individual patients, but also acting in the world. By this time, the scientific establishment was also beginning to have a much broader conversation. We began to see, for example, that thoughts, this is early 70s, that thoughts and feelings could affect the immune system. I was in medical school 8, 10 years before. Everybody thought they were totally separate. The nervous system and what you thought and feel had no control over the immune system. But the research began to come out. So there was a kind of convergence of ancient wisdom and modern science and my own growing curiosity and experience. So all of that opened me up. And then I began to explore the whole field of mind-body medicine.
In many ways, your why is your natural curiosity, which I think is a wonderful starting point. One question I've always wanted to ask you is about chronic stress or being stuck in a state of low grade, constant stress or stress mode. I think a lot of my listeners are going to resonate with that and feel that way, or that they feel that they're stuck in a constant state of stress, or maybe not anxiety, but something akin to it. Because I really want to double click on the idea behind the fact that the mind and the body are actually connected, can you help us understand what happens to us physically, biologically, when we're stuck in a stress loop?
Sure, and it's a great question and very important. When we are threatened, there's the autonomic nervous system in our body. Autonomic is basically the same word as automatic. It operates outside our control. What happens when human beings, like all vertebrates, are threatened? And for vertebrates, most vertebrates, the threat is mostly a predator, physical threat. Human beings, the threat can be psychological threat, an interpersonal threat, as well as a physical threat. It can be the threat of a work situation. We treat it as if it were a threat to our very being. And so we go into what we all learn in basic physiology, the fight or flight response. Now, this is a life-saving response, potentially, but it's meant to be quickly turned on and quickly turned off. So the classic examples of fight or flight, and anybody can see this in one of the nature films, is a gazelle is at a watering hole in the Serengeti plain. A lion comes along and the gazelle is off and running. Their biological programming tells them there's a choice between fight and flight. Gazelle does not fight a lion, so the gazelle runs. If the gazelle is fortunate enough to get away, 3 minutes later, and you can see this on the film, the gazelle is happily grazing. Fight or flight came, did its job, and it's gone. We humans carry that lion around with us. Sometimes we live with that lion, and sometimes we work underneath that lion. And sometimes the lions seem all over the place. So what happens is we go into a chronic state of fight or flight, and it's low grade. It's not, people may not feel like I'm jumping out of my skin, but the results persist. So what happens in fight or flight is in order to run away, your heart has to beat faster, your blood pressure goes up, the big muscles in your body get tense. So you can either, depending on your genetic programming, you either fight or you run, but you need your big muscles in any case. Digestion gets suppressed because if a lion's after you, you're not a time to stop for a snack. You got to get away.
Right.
In your brain, there's activity in the amygdala. This is all mediated by the autonomic nervous system, by the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system, which we can think of as the gas, and turning us on, getting us ready to deal with a threat. And the amygdala is a center of fear and anger. When we're in fight or flight, there's much more activity in the amygdala. In fact, if fight or flight is chronic, the amygdala grows larger. At the same time, there's suppression of activity in our frontal cortex and the areas responsible for thoughtful decision-making, for self-awareness, for compassion.
What is the amygdala responsible for, doctor?
Fear and anger.
Just fear and anger. Okay.
Basically, fear and anger. Yeah, it's responsible for fear. So the amygdala is in overdrive. Fear and anger are persisting. We're not thinking as clearly. We also, our connectivity between the vagus nerve, which is what can quiet our bodies, and other cranial nerves, other nerves that are responsible for speech and facial expression, that connectivity is cut short.
Pardon me for interrupting. Could you explain the vagus nerve? I had a Pilates instructor once who started to teach me about it, and I thought she was asking me if I wanted to train in Las Vegas for about a good 20 seconds. I had never heard of it before.
Okay, Vegas is a Latin word. It means wandering, and it's the 10th cranial nerve. There are 12 nerves that come out of our head. The vagus nerve is the 10th. And it is the basis or the sort of the largest structure in the parasympathetic nervous system. It goes up from the belly, through the chest, back to the central nervous system, to the brain. And it is the primary operator in creating a state of resting and digesting. And it is the antidote when it's activated by techniques like slow, deep breathing, for example. It is the antidote to the fight or flight response. When we're in the state of fight or flight, when we're under chronic stress, the vagus nerve is not functioning maximally. It's overwhelmed by the sympathetic nervous system.
Thank you.
So we're putting out adrenaline when the sympathetic nervous system is activated. After a little while, we're putting out more cortisol, the stress hormone. So we're really in this state of kind of high readiness and anxiety. Now, over time, it usually doesn't stay at that enormously high level. That may be, for example, if you're what we see in combat soldiers, it's very high, just has to stay high for a while. But even after battle, it may be in overdrive. And with people with chronic stress here, where we're not in the middle of a war, there's always an excessive level of sympathetic nervous system stimulation, that ongoing fight or flight response. So what happens is we sometimes have difficulty concentrating, may have difficulty sleeping. We become more easily impatient with other people. It's sometimes harder to make connections with other people because we're sort of in this excited state, and we're kind of hyper vigilant. We're looking out for what's the next blow, what's the next threat going to come. So that's the state that people are in, and that can contribute to every chronic illness that we have. Anxiety, depression, hypertension, diabetes, and stress over a long period of time can also contribute to cancer, contribute to all the autoimmune illnesses, osteoarthritis, primarily rheumatoid arthritis, pain syndromes are all accentuated by stress. Stress can precipitate migraines. I mean, it's not the sole cause of most things, but it's a very major cause. It disrupts our digestion. And then the muscle tension that people have, the headaches that are so prevalent. And all of this is significantly related to the question you asked, the chronic level of stress.
That's really helpful, doctor. One of the other things that's fascinating about your experience is that you have fearlessly worked in conflict zones over the course of your career, from Bosnia to Kosovo, South Sudan, and many, unfortunately, other parts of the world. But in those environments, you still managed to uncover that there's a human ability to recover from chronic stress, from trauma. What did you learn in those war zones that everyday people who aren't in a war zone, but as we were just talking about, are experiencing that low-grade stress, that they can use to combat that connectivity between the brain and the body that's causing them physical ailments in addition to mental ones? What can they do? What are the simple things?
Sure. Well, first of all, I can't say I was fearless. I like to help people, and I like to be where the action is. So I'm willing to go through my fear and to acknowledge it and to, as best I can, learn from it. So everything that I do, and it's interesting where your question is leading me, everything that I do is also teaching me about myself. So I have to recognize, what are my fears? What are my limitations? And how do I deal with them? And it's through, yes, there's scientific literature, but I think it's what I've found, and I think what many of us have found who are doing the kind of work that I do, is that it's our own experience that is such a deep teacher. So what I've learned is to be present with people in those situations. That's the first thing. And that's what people need. When there's overwhelming trauma, people are in ongoing state of fight or flight. And also they're in another state that we haven't yet talked about called the freeze response. So in a war zone, for example, for civilians, where they can't get out of it, they can't fight, they go into often, they just want to protect themselves and their families. They go into a kind of shutdown. And what they do is, and you see, I'm sort of clutching my,
Yeah.
my arms like this.
There's a
That
physical.
happens. The body kind of shuts down and they put out endorphins to numb themselves against both physical and psychological pain. And often enough, they withdraw. So one of the things that you see in a war zone is not only are people agitated, but they're often emotionally withdrawn. And also they feel very alone because of the way the freeze response and the fight or flight response works. They feel like even though cognitively, rationally, they can see everybody suffering, they feel like they're alone with their suffering. So what I've learned is the first thing is, and this applies to peacetime as well, is to be there with people. And what people tell me and tell our team everywhere we go, this is the first time anybody's really sat down and wanted to hear me. Helping people move through these stressful situations can be augmented and deepened incredibly by having them be part of a group. So a lot of the work that we do and that we train clinicians and educators and community leaders to do is how to lead groups, and to lead groups in which people have a chance to use the techniques of self-care and to share their experience with other people, with nobody interrupting, nobody analyzing, just letting people make the discoveries for themselves and saying to people also that it is possible to go through this trauma. I begin my book that you mentioned, Transforming Trauma, by telling stories of Americans who had some of the most horrendous childhoods one can imagine, being trafficked as a small child, 6, 7-year-old girl, having brutal parents, having terrible physical injuries, all these really terrible, overwhelming, traumatic experiences, and saying and showing, because I've seen it and I've helped to facilitate it, that these people can come through these experiences and come out on the other side. That's really important, that understanding, whether it's working with the patient here in my office in Washington, D.C., or working in a war zone, is to be able to say truthfully, based on my experience, it is possible to come through what you've experienced, as horrible as it may be. So being present with people, telling them, yes, it's possible to come through, ideally creating a group, and then teaching self-care techniques. I always, just about always begin by teaching people how to breathe slowly and deeply, in through the nose and out through the mouth, with the belly soft and relaxed. And maybe the people who are watching us or listening can do that for themselves, just for a couple of minutes as I'm talking. What this does is it mobilizes the vagus nerve and it provides an antidote to that fight or flight response. So I teach this to people. I teach it to people in the middle of a war. I teach it to people in my office. I teach it to medical students. I teach it to groups of executives who've come together. And what people see, even me slowing down for a few minutes, I don't know if it made a difference to you.
I enjoyed it.
So I do this for 10 or 12 minutes. And as I do that, I go through the physiology and in detail about the vagus nerve and how it operates and lowers blood pressure and slows heart rate. At the end of 10 or 12 minutes, 80 to 90% of people notice change, even with bombs falling outside, even if they've been in a state of high anxiety. Now, people notice I'm calmer, the room's brighter, my heart rate is slowed, my hands are warmer, I'm seeing things around me I haven't seen before. So that tells people, not because I'm telling them, their own experience tells them, you can make a difference. You can quiet this anxiety. You can come into balance. And that's really important when we're being driven by our anxiety, or when we're in a situation that is continually producing anxiety. We may not be able to control what else is happening outside, but we can control our response to it. And if it doesn't happen the first time people do soft belly breathing, It usually happens the second or third time. And if some people are still too antsy to be able to sit still and do this, I have other techniques where I get them moving their body very actively, which then can bring them to a state of calm.
It's amazing just taking a couple of minutes to breathe, what that can do for your entire body in terms of a reset. Let me ask you this one, Doc. We're always exposed as humans today to crises, violence, catastrophes through news and social media. And I'm curious if you've looked into what that exposure, that frequent, incessant exposure does to the adult nervous system. And I'm also really curious about what it does to children.
I'm a psychiatrist, and like a good psychiatrist, I'm going to ask you the question that you've just asked me. What does it do to you?
It makes me angry sometimes. Sometimes it makes me stressed out. Sometimes it makes me feel helpless. Sometimes it feels like a call to action to say something. I would say even this discussion felt like a call to action, that there was a lot going on in the world. I've created a platform and I should use my platform to help other people cope with the stress and anxiety around them. But that's how I maneuver my way through it. But I don't find it easy, doctor. I do not.
No, and I think, first of all, you're aware of what it's doing, which is great. The problem, I think, is or the greater problem is when people are not aware. It's very easy to become addicted. I can see that in myself. I'm not a great, user of social media, but if I start following a thread, I can feel myself, I want to keep going. I want to see what's next, and I want to see what this other person has to say about it. So I think it can become addictive. So we have to learn, become aware of that, and say to ourselves, it's time to stop, or it's not time to start. And if it does get us worked up in one way or another, I think your response is great. Sometimes it gets you wanting to do things. And that's basically generally quite a good thing, that it makes you want to do things. I think part of the problem with social media is that the not just the media, but it's the algorithms that tend to funnel the same kind of message over and over and over and over again. And that is addictive also. And I think as parents, part of our job is, if our kids are getting fixated or addicted in some way, to help them to develop critical thinking. One of the great, uh, I don't know, tragedies perhaps of our time is the discouragement of critical thinking.
Mhm.
To come back to your original question, if we get fixated on us, so many people go into fight or flight when they're looking at and they do become enraged, and I understand it. But here again, stop, do some deep breathing, go for a run, go for a walk, spend time with your children or your friends, be in nature. Don't become so fixated on it, because that's really the danger. I think the two danger is fixation and the narrowness of that fixation.
You say that trauma is a fact of life, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence. Can you explain what you mean by that in a little more detail? And I think it'd be really helpful to learn of, anecdotally, not obviously using names, but maybe a patient or two who has overcome some significant trauma. I think it's helpful for us to hear what makes someone successful in overcoming trauma.
Well, I think where you started your question and where I start the book is that trauma comes to all of us. It is a part of life. It is not something that just comes to those other people, the ones with the most horrendous childhoods, or the people who are caught up in wars. And this is an understanding that indigenous people all over the world have, as far as I can tell, always had. Trauma is a Greek word that means wound or injury. So if it doesn't happen when you're young, from poverty or congenital abnormality or brutal family, it may well happen as a young adult. And then if it doesn't come then, it may come in midlife. Divorce is 99% of the time traumatic. And then, of course, the loss of people we love, grandparents and parents. And then as we grow older, we ourselves have to deal with physical frailty. That is traumatic. if you can't do what you've already always done. And then facing death. Death is a kind of universal trauma for us. So trauma is a part of life. And I think that understanding that takes it out of the realm of psychopathology, out of the realm of to be hidden, or indeed out of the realm of something to boast about. It's just part of life. And so once we have that understanding, then we can begin to orient ourselves to dealing with that trauma. And this is the point of my book, Transforming Trauma, to seeing it as an opportunity for great personal growth. What trauma does is it disrupts everything, all of the structures that have sustained us up until that time. This is I don't mean if it happens at birth. At birth, it's somewhat different. But what trauma generally does for those of us, for older children or adults, is it breaks up the physical, the psychological, the social structures. Everything comes into question, and we kind of withdraw and we're overwhelmed. But in that breaking up of those structures, there's also potentially, if it's dealt with sort of compassion and wisdom, it can be the opening to a whole larger experience. In indigenous communities around the world, experiencing a trauma, whether it's a life-threatening illness or a psychosis or a terrible family tragedy, the way you experience and the way you're able to move through that trauma kind of certifies you as somebody who can help other people, because it is understood that a wisdom can come. You take a step back from everything. You begin to see and perhaps appreciate other people more.
Mm-hmm.
You begin to have compassion for yourself. I don't have to be perfect. One of the things that's a curse of our society is that everybody thinks they have to be perfect in every way. And you see, I'm not perfect. And there's a great relaxation that comes from that, and a greater ability to appreciate ourselves, much greater compassion for ourselves. So, and then all the techniques that I teach in Transforming Trauma that we use wherever we're working, those techniques give us an experience of our own capacity to bring ourselves into balance, and then to use our imagination to explore alternatives, to explore frontiers that we didn't even know existed before. And then ideally having the support of other people as we do that, sort of deepens our experience, makes it easier because they're there for us, and also deepens our appreciation of who other human beings are and of what's possible for them.
You definitely are hearing more and seeing more about alternative medicines, meaning ketamine treatments, psychedelics for managing things like trauma. I'm curious to get your perspective on the medical side of that, as well as the alternative side of that, how you think those potential sources of cures are they effective? Do they carry risks?
It's a great question, and I'm glad you're asking it. Sometimes people don't want to hear about it. They just want to avoid that question.
I love uncomfortable questions.
Good. Well, psychedelics will help you address the uncomfortable questions. Psychedelics are very powerful. I had a good deal of personal experience of psychedelics over 60 years. So I understand the power. I also understand how terrifying they can be at times. And so what I would say is, and there's a growing body of medical, psychiatric, scientific literature that is showing the benefits of a variety of psychedelics for a variety of conditions, including addiction to alcohol and drugs and tobacco, to people with post-traumatic stress disorder, people who are depressed, people at the end of life who are facing that particular trauma. So I think that there's great promise with psychedelics. They sort of break up some of the repetitive conditioning that we have in what's called the default mode network in the brain.
What do they actually do to your brain?
Well, I think we're just at the beginning of understanding everything that they do. But there is a kind of disruption of this default mode network, which is a kind of our habitual ways of thinking and reacting. There's also psychedelics seem to promote neuroplasticity. When I was going through medical school, we were told the brain does not change after the age of 21. It's all that's fixed. It's not true.
We know that not to be true today.
Now, techniques like soft belly breathing or the active meditations, the movement and the dance that we use, and also psychedelics can promote neuroplasticity, uh, chemically increase the level of brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's a big, long name for a chemical that helps the brain to rebuild itself. And the brain rewires itself or can rewire itself. So I was just at a retreat for veterans using psilocybin with veterans, a retreat run by a former Special Forces soldier with clinicians there as well. And I was really struck by the changes that people experienced from 2 psilocybin sessions over a course of 7 days. The changes in the way they looked at themselves, the way they dealt with trauma. And then I was also talking with many of the people who were helpers who had themselves used psychedelics. Some of them psychologists, very highly trained psychologists, others retired Army veterans. And all of them spoke of major changes coming about, major changes in the way they dealt with alcohol, for example, either stopping drinking or going from being a war traumatized problem drinker to having an occasional social drink, changes in their relationships with their husbands and wives and children. I think we're just at the beginning of understanding what's possible with psychedelics. I think your question about cautions, I think it's really important um, to use psychedelics with people who know what they're doing in a supportive context. And it's really important as well to have support, to have what they call in the field integration of the experience. The idea is for the psychedelic experience, yes, it's an amazing experience, perhaps terrifying, amazing, enlightening, but what does it have to do with the rest of your life? And so it's very important, and most of the good research that's being done is being done with the use of psychedelics, one or several or many times, together with some kind of ongoing therapeutic support.
Doctor, is ketamine a psychedelic?
Yeah, ketamine is a psychedelic. Ketamine originally was developed as an anesthetic and is used a great deal, particularly, it's used with humans, but especially with animals. But it also can be a psychedelic. And the research is pretty good on the use of ketamine for what we call treatment-resistant depression. People who've used antidepressant drugs, have been in psychotherapy, who use ketamine a series of times and no longer are so profoundly depressed.
I'm running out of time with you, which breaks my heart a bit because I think I could talk to you for another 2 hours. But I want to ask you one last question, which is for people listening to you today, if they walk away from this podcast and there's one thing they can do that will help their immune system, their physical health, their mental health, their personal relationships, their ability to concentrate, to sleep, what's that one thing? Is it deep breathing? Is it soft belly?
Yeah, I would say the first thing would be to do the soft belly breathing. You can obviously read about it in Transforming Trauma. You can look at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine website, cmbm.org, and you'll have me going through the whole 12-minute exercise with teaching it. That brings us into balance. And then start exploring some of the other techniques, some of the other possibilities. One of the other things I just want to mention is how important expressive meditations are.
Who could we
And the first one that I teach and that we teach in our training and that we teach in the small groups that our trainees lead, we've trained 8,000 people around the world to do this work. And I want to mention that maybe some of our viewers are interested. You're interested in learning for yourself, and you may be interested in working with other people. We've found we can train not only psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, but we can train people who've never had any background in psychology, but who are intelligent and want to learn themselves and are committed to helping other people. We can train them in this model, train them how to work with coworkers or employees or at their church or synagogue or mosque, wherever they want to bring this work. What's really important in working with trauma, but also working in general, if you're tense and tight, is doing expressive meditations. These are the oldest kinds of meditations on the planet. There are concentrated meditations like soft belly breathing, concentrating on the breath, on the word soft and belly, or concentrating on a mantra or the waves. There are mindfulness meditations, and then there are the oldest meditations on the planet that indigenous people have done for thousands of years, moving the body to music that's energizing for you. What happens is just so much energy comes up. It's a combination of people feeling energized and relaxed. Emotions that have been buried come up: anger, frustration, sadness, joy. They all will come out. So it's really helpful. And I would just encourage people to explore. And it's not part of our customary therapeutic approach in our Western societies. Indigenous people do it everywhere. But I would say that every patient I see, just about regardless of what they come to me for, chronic stress, heart disease, cancer, I have them doing an expressive meditation like shaking and dancing, which is easy. Anybody can do it. We do it with people in wheelchairs. And I have them doing the soft belly breathing to begin with. And that creates the balance and brings up the energy so that all the other things we may want to do, whether they're self-care techniques or actions in the world, become much easier. Become curious. Take a look. See what's there. And do it for yourself. Check it out. This is not a matter of belief. The science is there. The approach I'm describing, we published 30 papers in peer-reviewed journals on the effectiveness of this approach for depression, for stress, for post-traumatic stress. But try it for yourself and see what's possible.
Doctor, I want to thank you not only for joining me today on Straight to Why. I'm so grateful that you came, but also, and I think critically importantly, for the work that you've done for all of us and for the world, and for the deep intellectual horsepower you've put behind helping people heal. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda. And for people who want to be in touch, you can get in touch with me. J. Gordon, Gordon, initial J, at cmbm.org. We want people to be involved. We want to, the whole idea is to teach people what we have to teach and engage people who are interested in becoming part of this work. So I'm really grateful to you for having me on your show.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Doctor.